They called her Lady Alara, but the name was a ghost, a whisper of a life she no longer lived. Once, it had meant silk gowns the color of summer skies and the murmur of admiration in the castle's great hall. It had meant the scent of polished wood and beeswax, the delicate weight of a silver fork in her hand. Now, the name was an irony, a cruel joke. Her father, the Baron von Hesse, spat like a bitter seed. Her world was no longer one of color and light, it was a tapestry woven from sound, scent, and the chilling geography of her own disgrace. A fever, 2 winters past, had stolen her sight, leaving behind an impenetrable shroud of darkness. In her father's eyes, it had not just blinded her, it had erased her. A daughter who could not be married off for political gain was not a daughter at all. She was a flaw in his lineage, a crack in the pristine marble of his ambition. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet cobblestones and the sour breath of the city's refuse. It clung to the thin wool of her dress, a garment once fit for a servant, now her only possession. Her father's guards had dragged her from her small, cold room in the castle's forgotten wing and propelled her toward the town square. Her bare feet recoiled from the damp, uneven stones. The sounds were a cacophony of torment, the jeers of the crowd, the lowing of cattle, and, piercing through it all, her father's voice, a blade of cold iron. He stood on a raised platform, a figure of rigid authority she could feel even without seeing. Behold, he boomed, his voice echoing off the surrounding stone facades. A baron's daughter. Of noble blood, yet of no use. A mouth to feed, a shadow in my halls. A wave of murmuring, laced with cruel laughter, washed over her. She stood beside him, a statue of humiliation, her head held high by sheer, desperate will. Memory, a merciless artist, painted the scene for her in agonizing detail, the judgmental eyes, the pointing fingers, the sneering lips. She felt the weight of their gazes like a physical blow. But I am a practical man, the Baron continued, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous, performative reason. This barony needs salt. The trade routes are choked, the merchants demand a fortune. A fortune I will not waste on vanity. He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle over the assembled townsfolk. So I make this offer. My daughter, Lady Alara, to any man who will deliver to my storehouses 1 full wagon of salt. Let it be known that Baron von Hesse values the preservation of his people over the coddling of a useless child. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, quickly followed by a fresh torrent of mockery. He was not just disowning her, he was assigning her a price, a value less than a common preservative. He was turning his own blood into a commodity, a public spectacle designed to broadcast his cold, unyielding pragmatism. His cruelty was not born of rage, but of calculation. She was a loose thread in the tapestry of his power, and he was snipping her away with surgical precision, right here, in the heart of the world that had once been hers to command. In the thick of the crowd stood Thomas, the baker. The scent of yeast and warm flour seemed to cling to him even here, a small pocket of comfort in the sour air. His hands, broad and dusted with a permanent layer of white, were clenched into fists at his sides. He was a man carved from quiet grief, his face a landscape of sorrow since his wife, Anya, had been taken by a fever a year ago, the same season the Lady Alara had lost her sight. Beside him, his son, Leo, a small boy of 6, clung to his leg. The child had not spoken a single word since the day his mother's warmth had vanished from their little home above the bakery. Leo's world was one of profound silence, a fortress no one could breach. Thomas looked at the woman on the platform. He saw not the Baron's useless child, but a figure of impossible stillness, a lonely island of dignity in an ocean of contempt. He had heard the stories of her grace and intelligence before the darkness took her. Now, he saw a spirit refusing to be broken. The Baron's offer hung in the air, a grotesque invitation. Men in the crowd shouted lewd jokes, appraising her like livestock. No one with a wagon of salt would make such a fool's trade. But Thomas had a wagon of salt. He had spent the better part of a year saving, bartering, working extra hours before the dawn, all to acquire enough salt to see his bakery through the coming winter and spring, to preserve meats and cure doughs. It was the sum of his labor, the entirety of his security. A voice, not his own, seemed to well up from a deep, honorable place within him. I will take your offer. The words, rough and clear, cut through the din. The crowd parted as he walked forward, little Leo still clutching his trousers. The Baron stared down, his face a mask of disbelief, then contempt. "A common baker? You have a wagon of salt," he sneered. "I do, my lord," Thomas said, his voice steady. "It is my entire winter supply." "It is yours, in exchange for the lady." A vein throbbed in the Baron's temple. To be taken up on his grand gesture by a flour-dusted commoner was a humiliation of its own. But the words had been spoken publicly. His honor, such as it was on the line. "Done," he clipped, turning his back on Elara as if the transaction were already forgotten. He had sold his daughter for seasoning. Thomas mounted the platform. He did not grab her arm or pull her. He stopped before her and spoke softly, his voice a low rumble against the fading jeers of the crowd. "My Lady Elara," he said, the title a small act of rebellion. "My name is Thomas. I am a baker. If you would permit me, I will see you to safety." She could not see the hand he offered, but she could feel the warmth of his presence, the utter lack of malice in his voice. It was the first kindness she had been shown in 2 years. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He gently placed her hand on his forearm, and the calloused texture of his skin was a shock after the cold smoothness of the guard's gauntlets. He led her down from the platform of her shame, moving slowly, carefully, guiding her through the throng. The journey from the town square to his bakery was a pilgrimage from one world to another. The sharp scent of iron and damp stone receded, replaced by the overwhelming, wholesome perfume of baking bread. It was a smell of life, of sustenance, of honest work. He guided her hand to a rough-hewn wooden door. It was solid, unadorned, and when it opened, a wave of warmth washed over her, carrying with it the aroma of wood smoke, cinnamon, and hearth. This was not a castle, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a sanctuary. Inside, the world was a symphony of warmth and gentle sounds. The crackle of the fire in the great brick oven, the soft scuff of his boots on the flour-dusted floorboards. He led her to a simple wooden chair by the hearth. "Please," he said, "rest here." She expected orders, a list of chores, the rough treatment of a purchased thing. Instead, he moved about the room, his voice a low murmur describing the space. "To your left is the hearth," he said. "The oven is behind you. It will keep you warm." He brought her a bowl of thick, savory stew and a heel of fresh bread, its crust still crackling. The food was simple, honest, and more satisfying than any of the cold, elaborate meals she had eaten alone in her castle room. He did not watch her eat, he gave her the dignity of privacy, turning to his own work, the gentle, rhythmic thud of dough being kneaded on a wooden board. Later, when the fire was banked and the bakery was quiet, he led her up a short flight of stairs to a small, clean room. The air smelled of lavender and sun-dried linen. "This was my room," he explained, his voice softer now. "The bed is warm. I will sleep by the hearth downstairs. You will be safe here." The unadorned generosity of the act stunned her into silence. He had traded his entire fortune for her, and his first act was to give her his own bed, expecting nothing in return. The next morning, as the first hints of dawn filtered through the single window, he explained himself. He brought her a mug of hot, milky tea and sat at a small table across from her. It was then she heard the other presence in the room, a small, shuffling sound. "This is my son, Leo," Thomas said, his voice filled with a profound, aching tenderness. He does not speak." Not since his mother passed. Elara heard a small intake of breath nearby, the sound of a curious child. Thomas continued, his words slow and deliberate, as if confessing a great secret. "My Lord Baron, he saw a burden. The townsfolk, they saw a spectacle. I looked at you, my lady, and I saw a woman of education. I heard you used to read to the orphans in the village, that your voice was a comfort. Anya, my wife, she used to fill this house with stories. Now there is only silence." He hesitated, the vulnerability raw in his voice. "I am a simple man. I can bake bread and stack wood. I cannot reach my son in his silence. I hoped, that maybe a gentle voice, a story, might build a bridge to him. I did not buy a servant, Lady Alara. I was desperate enough to hope I could find a teacher. His confession rearranged her world. He had not rescued her out of pity, nor purchased her for use. He had seen a value in her that her own father had declared extinct: her mind, her voice, her knowledge. He was asking for her help. That day, she sat by the fire with the small, silent boy. She felt him settle on a stool near her feet, a timid, watchful presence. She began not with a complex tale, but with a simple poem she remembered from her nursery, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then growing stronger as the familiar cadence returned. She spoke of brave knights and clever foxes, of stars that sang and rivers that whispered secrets. She did not know if the boy was listening, but she spoke into the silence anyway, filling the warm air with worlds he could perhaps see in his mind. For the first time since the fever, she felt a flicker of purpose. She was not a broken noblewoman or a baker's property. She was a storyteller. She was needed. This single, fragile thought was the first stone laid in the foundation of her own reconstruction. The days bled into weeks, creating a quiet rhythm that became the new language of their lives. In the evenings, after Leo was asleep, the warmth of the cooling brick oven would draw them into conversation. The bakery, fragrant with the ghosts of the day's baking, became a confessional. Alara, tracing the rim of a clay mug, spoke of the creeping coldness that had followed her blindness, a chill that had little to do with the temperature of the castle stones and everything to do with her father's heart. She described the loneliness of her dark world, a world where her worth had been tethered to her sight. Thomas, his large hands resting on the worn wood of the table, spoke of Anya. He spoke of her laughter, which had sounded like tumbling bells, and the way she would steal warm rolls from the cooling rack, her eyes sparkling with mischief. He confessed the guilt that gnawed at him, the feeling that he had somehow failed to protect her from the swift, merciless illness that had claimed her, the same illness that had stolen his son's voice. In their shared histories of loss, they built a bridge of empathy, two solitary souls discovering they were not entirely alone in their grief. One night, a fierce winter storm descended upon the town, a howling beast of wind and snow. The bakery's shutters rattled, and the wind screamed down the chimney, making the fire dance and spit. They had brought Leo downstairs to sleep on a pallet by the hearth, where the warmth was greatest. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore a shutter from its hinges with a deafening crack of splintering wood. The sound ripped through the small space, and Leo, startled from his sleep, let out a sharp, terrified cry, not a word, but a raw, animal sound of fear. In the ensuing chaos, as Thomas moved to secure the window, Alara stood up, disoriented by the sudden noise and the rush of frigid air. She took a step and her foot caught on the leg of a stool, sending her stumbling forward into the darkness. She braced for the impact of the hard floor, but it never came. Instead, she was caught in a powerful, steady grip. Thomas's arms enveloped her, his broad chest a solid wall against her back. One of his hands held her arm, the other rested firmly on her waist. It was a touch devoid of pity or duty. It was purely protective, instinctual, and in its simple strength, breathtakingly intimate. For a long moment, they stood frozen, the storm raging outside and a different, more turbulent storm building between them. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her shoulder blades, and she knew he could feel the tremor that ran through her. From that night on, the unspoken language between them deepened. Their small world was a choreography of quiet care. He would leave a warm, wet cloth by the basin for her in the mornings. She learned the precise location of the flour bin, the salt crock, the herb jars, her hands moving with a new confidence. She began to help him, her sensitive fingers perfect for discerning the texture of a perfectly proof dough or for crimping the edges of a pie crust. He would guide her hands with his own, his touch lingering for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Their movements became a dance of domestic intimacy. Leo was the heart of their silent communication. The boy, who still had not spoken, would take her hand and lead her to the small patch of winter herbs by the window, so she could feel the resilient life in their leaves. He would press small, smooth stones he'd found into her palm. He was a bridge between their two solitudes, and in their shared, gentle care for him, their own feelings for each other grew, unspoken but as real and nourishing as the bread they baked together. The quiet harmony of their small world could not last. A bubble of peace in a sea of judgment is a fragile thing. The story of the baron's daughter living with the common baker became a venomous whisper that slithered through the town's alleyways and markets. Women would fall silent as Ilara passed, guided by Thomas's arm. Men would smirk at the baker, their eyes filled with a mixture of envy and contempt. The gossip inevitably reached the ears of the baron, and it curdled his cold pride into active malice. He was not merely indifferent to his daughter anymore, he was incensed. Her survival in the humble bakery was an affront, a public testament to a kindness that shamed his own cruelty. He began to apply pressure. Merchants who had supplied Thomas with flour for years suddenly found their own trade with the baron's lands threatened if they continued to deal with the baker. Thomas's supply of flour, the very lifeblood of his craft, began to dwindle. One bleak afternoon, a guard bearing the baron's crest arrived at the bakery. They were summoned to the castle. The walk there was a silent ordeal, the air thick with dread. The great hall, once a place of glittering balls for Ilara, was now a cold, echoing chamber of judgment. The baron sat upon his high-backed chair, a figure of immense, unyielding authority. He had expected to see his daughter shattered, a beggar in rags. Instead, she stood before him in a simple but clean dress, her posture erect, her face serene. Thomas stood beside her, his presence a silent shield. So, the baron began, his voice dripping with scorn, "The baker plays at being a nobleman, and my daughter plays at being a scullery maid. You have soiled my name, peasant. You have taken what is mine and dragged it through the dirt of your common existence." Before Thomas could speak, Ilara stepped forward. Her voice, though quiet, resonated with a strength that filled the cavernous hall. "He has soiled nothing," she said, her sightless eyes fixed in the direction of her father's voice. "He has shown me more honor in his humble home than I ever knew in this cold fortress." "You speak of nobility?" "I have found more of it in a handful of flour than in all your titles and lands." The baron was momentarily stunned into silence, his face contorting with rage at her defiance. His retaliation was swift and brutal. He issued a decree, forbidding any farmer or merchant in his domain from selling grain to Thomas, under penalty of ruinous taxes. The bakery, once a haven of warmth and life, grew quiet and cold. The last sack of flour was used, the final loaf baked and sold. They were facing starvation, pushed to the absolute edge of survival by a tyrant's wounded pride. One night, sitting before a meager fire fueled by scavenged wood, the weight of their predicament crushed them. Thomas, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, finally broke his stoic silence. "I am sorry, Ilara," he whispered, his voice thick with despair. "I thought I was saving you. I have only led you into another cage, a cage of poverty and hunger. I can't protect you. I can't protect my son's." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but they were not for their hardship. They were for him, for the noble, honorable man who blamed himself for another's cruelty. She reached out, her hand finding his across the small space between them. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "You gave me back my soul. Do you think I fear hunger when I have known such emptiness?" He squeezed her hand, his own trembling. "I have come to love you, Ilara," he confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "I love you with all that I am." In that moment of shared ruin, she gave him her own truth. "And I love you, Thomas. Your heart is the only home I have ever truly known." Their love, confessed in the face of absolute despair, became their final, defiant act of rebellion. Love gave them strength, but it was intelligence that would forge their weapon. In the days that followed, subsisting on thin vegetable broths and the kindness of a few brave neighbors who secretly shared what they could, Ilara's mind, sharp and honed by years of education, began to work. She sifted through memories of lessons with her old tutor, of conversations overheard, of the intricate laws that governed the land. "There is something," she said one evening, her voice electric with a dawning idea. "An old charter. The Bakers' Guild Charter of the Free Towns. It's ancient, from before the barons consolidated their power. It grants guild members the right to purchase grain from any source and guarantees passage on the king's roads, superseding local tariffs and decrees. It allows for a direct appeal to a regional magistrate if those rights are infringed." Thomas stared at her, hope warring with skepticism. "But how would we find such a charter?" How would we make such an appeal? My tutor, she replied, a plan forming with crystalline clarity. He was a man of the cloth, a monk from the Abbey of St. Giles, 2 days' ride from here. He believed knowledge was the only true power. I am certain he would have a copy. Their love and their integrity had not gone unnoticed. An elderly man on the town council, whose family Thomas had given bread to during a particularly harsh winter long ago, had watched the Baron's persecution with growing disgust. He had seen the quiet dignity with which Thomas and Elara faced their ruin, the gentle care they gave the silent boy. He came to them under the cover of darkness. The Baron has gone too far, the old man declared. He mistakes cruelty for strength. He was not the only one. Others whom Thomas had helped in small ways over the years, a mended fence here, a shared meal there, began to rally. His quiet decency had planted seeds of loyalty all over the town. When they learned of Elara's plan, the old councilman drafted a petition, attesting to Thomas's unimpeachable character and detailing the Baron's vindictive sanctions. He and a dozen other brave townsfolk signed it. One of them, a young man whose horse was the swiftest in the region, volunteered to make the dangerous ride to the abbey and then to the magistrate's court, carrying the petition and Elara's urgent request. The magistrate, a stern man of the law intrigued by the invocation of the near-forgotten charter, agreed to hear the case. He decreed it would be held in the town square, the very stage of Elara's initial humiliation. The day was cold and grey, but the square was packed. The Baron arrived with his retinue, radiating an aura of arrogant certainty. He presented his case first, speaking of his rights as Baron, of maintaining order, of punishing a commoner who had overreached and a daughter who had disgraced him. Then it was Elara's turn. Thomas stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, a silent, solid anchor. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead for pity. She simply spoke. With breathtaking precision, she laid out the articles of the ancient charter. She cited precedent and law, her argument a brilliant, unassailable structure of logic and reason. She spoke not of her personal suffering, but of the principles of justice the Baron had violated. Her intellect, the very quality her father had deemed useless, shone like a beacon in the grey afternoon. The crowd, and the magistrate, were captivated. This was not a disgraced woman, this was a formidable legal mind, a voice of truth speaking against tyranny. The magistrate's decision was swift and unequivocal. The ancient charter was law, and the Baron had broken it. He ruled that Thomas's rights as a guild baker were restored, and he publicly censured the Baron for his abuse of power. A gasp went through the crowd, followed by a rising murmur of approval. Baron von Hesse stood defeated, his authority publicly challenged and found wanting. He had been undone not by a rival lord with an army, but by the blind daughter he had traded for salt, her mind his sharpest and most unexpected sword. His power was not broken, but it was diminished, his reputation forever stained by the public record of his hypocrisy. He was left a figure of scorn, a mirror of the very humiliation he had sought to inflict upon his child. They walked back to the bakery not as outcasts, but as victors. The journey was different this time. People nodded to them, their faces holding a newfound respect. A cart loaded with sacks of flour, paid for by a collection taken up by the councilman and their new allies, was already waiting for them outside the door. Their home was no longer a besieged fortress, but a true kingdom, its foundations built not on stone or title, but on courage, love, and the unshakable nobility of the human spirit. Their life together, once a fragile hope, was now a certainty. A few mornings later, the sun streamed through the bakery window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warm, flower-scented air. Elara stood beside Thomas at the great wooden table, her hands deep in a mound of soft dough. He stood behind her, his hands gently guiding hers, their familiar, silent rhythm a perfect expression of their partnership. Leo, drawn by the comforting sounds and smells, came to her side. He watched them for a moment, his small face serious. Then, he reached up and touched Elara's cheek with his small hand, a gesture of profound affection. She turned her face toward his touch and smiled. And then, a miracle unfolded in the quiet of the morning. The boy, who had been locked in silence for over a year, looked at the woman who had filled his world with stories and his home with a new warmth, and he spoke. The word was soft, but perfectly clear, a bell ringing in the stillness. Mama, the sound washed over them, a wave of pure, unadulterated grace, healing the last of the old wounds and baptizing their new family in its light. For true worth is never a birthright, handed down like a crown or a castle. It is a thing forged in the heart, tempered by hardship, and polished by love. It is the dignity that remains when everything else is stripped away. True nobility is not the blood that runs in your veins, but the honor with which you live your life. And true sight, the kind that matters most, has nothing to do with the eyes. It is the profound, courageous act of seeing the light in another soul, even when all the world sees is darkness. It is the vision that recognizes a kingdom in a humble bakery, and a queen in a woman the world had thrown away.